So we're talking bucks growing antlers. So that requires a lot of nutrients. We're talking does growing fawns, bone, muscle, all that good stuff. And then eventually birthing that fawn and having to turn everything that they eat into milk. So we're talking some very stressful situations, some situations that require a lot of excess nutrients that maybe they didn't need other times of the year. We're also talking about a time of the year where it's extremely hot outside. And it just so happens that any of the good spring green up that we got back in the April, May rains, that vegetation that was produced is no longer very high quality. So it's kind of like a situation, these late summer stress periods, that's tough. That's why we call them the stress period, right? It's a tough situation. Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Jacob Dykes.
And I'm Eric Mitchell, and we're the co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab.
As hunters, deer biologists, and wildlife professors, we're passionate about bridging the gap between research and management.
Each episode, we explore the latest deer research from around the country, breaking it down to discuss how it can improve wildlife and habitat management on your land.
Whether you're a hunter, a land steward, or simply interested in deer biology, Deer University is for you. All right, welcome back to Deer University. Eric, how's it going today?
It's going great. How are you doing, Jacob?
I'm good. All is good. It's been a good weekend. Glad to be back talking deer management. What do we got today?
Well, by the time you're hearing this episode, we're early August here in Mississippi, so we're gonna be talking a lot about nutritional limitations of the deer herd.
Yeah, we're at that point in time, that point in the year that it's we've got several things that are kind of stacking on top of each other, right? That makes life a little more difficult, a little more stressful, if you will, for whitetail. And one of those, just kind of starting at the base here, is if you think about the way that vegetation works, right? So we get those spring rains. Hopefully, some places may not. Y'all know I just came up from South Texas. It's not always the case, but we get our spring rain. We get the green up. We've got this lush, very nutritious vegetation. And then as plants do, as they grow and progress, they are declining in quality. So now we've hit that point in time, late summer, vegetation quality is just not what it was a few months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're hitting that time of the year where there's a lot of important things going on for deer, whether we're talking about bucks or does. And now we have a lower quality vegetation on the ground. So that kind of sets the groundwork for what we need to talk about today.
Yeah. And if you think about that, as we go and start talking about these different stressors, you think about something like a white-tailed deer. Well, first off, they need to, on average, eat about 6 to 8% of their body weight in vegetation every day, right? And we're talking high-quality vegetation. We're not talking about like cattle that are, eating and just consuming as much grass as possible. We're talking about high-quality plants and high-quality parts of those plants. And again, to the tune of 6 to 8% of their body weight. And that's all while not being eaten by something. So as we go through these different stressors and these different events that these deer are going through during late summer, just keep that in mind. It's tough out there right now. It's tough. So let's kick off with antler growth. Let's start talking antlers, and I guess to set the tone a little bit more, when bucks come into the summer, they're already kind of at a loss, right? So they've lost potentially 30% or more of their body weight. So they're recovering already. Throughout the summer, hopefully they have recuperated, and then boom, now we got to grow some antlers.
Yeah, you think about it in terms of a hierarchy, they've got to put that body weight back on that they lost during the breeding season before they can really start to grow antlers. So making sure that there's adequate resources on the landscape there immediately following the rut is really, really important for maximizing antler growth on those bucks.
Yeah, because priority is not antler growth. That's what we'd like to think, that all of these resources are going to antler growth, but in fact, that's not the case at all, right? We've got to make sure that our, we've got the muscle mass and the fat that we need, and that they've got everything they need to make sure that physiology is working the way that it should, and all that kind of thing. And then those resources start going into things like antler growth, right?
Yeah, in terms of the hierarchy, antlers aren't the highest thing on the hierarchy for survival early on in the year, at least.
Yeah, despite what we would like, right? They
Exactly.
got to make sure they're healthy, that they're able to survive, and that they're able to reproduce. And then all of that extra stuff goes to the antlers. which is just one more reason to have these conversations and be managing habitat and all that kind of stuff, right? I have to throw that in there real quick. But yeah, so if we start talking antlers, we're talking about what we call a secondary sexual characteristic of a male deer, right? And all that means is exactly what we were just saying, right? So they put on these reserves, they're healthy, and then they put those resources into growing, which is essentially these bony organs out of the top of their head, which is pretty fascinating, right? So they're one of the only animals that can completely regenerate bone and do it every single year.
Yeah, antler growth is absolutely fascinating. I think one thing we should probably throw out there first is what's the difference between an antler and a bone? Or I'm sorry, an antler and a horn. A lot of times you hear people referring to antlers as horns on whitetails. And I think this might be a good opportunity to, even if you already know it, to cover the differences there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm glad you thrown that in there. So when we're talking antlers, right, we're talking something that's going to grow, living tissue is going to grow from the pedicle on the top of the head, and every year it's going to shed. And that's kind of and we'll go through that process here in a little bit. But when we're talking bone, horn, we're talking bones growing out of the top of the head that are permanent and typically have some kind of sheath over them, right?
Yeah, and the other difference with horns is they're made out of keratin, which is the same protein that your hair, your fingernails, so that's what is comprised of keratin. So different structures, both are very, very cool.
Yeah, they're cool. And fun fact, pronghorn are the only ones that tend to the only ones that have horns that tend to shed that sheath, right? So if you've actually got a buddy that's got a couple of those laying around, he's found. So they're pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. But now that we got that out of the way, jumping back into antlers and talking about antler growth and nutritional restrictions late in summer, antlers start growing again when we see that in the spring, when we see that spring green up, right? And when we start thinking about the spring green up, Jacob already talked about we have those spring rains, we have flush vegetation, high quality vegetation at that point in time, lots of water content, lots of different things going on with the nutrition on the landscape at that point in time.
Yeah, and it's actually photoperiod, or the day length that actually initiates antler growth. So antler growth is regulated by hormones, and the length of daylight given any given 24-hour period, how that changes throughout the year is actually what triggers the different hormones to say, hey, it's time to start growing antlers. And so as that growing day length changes, you see this reduction in like melatonin production. And this is what initiates, says, okay, it's time we start kicking back in that antler growth. And then you'll see this throughout late, spring and summer, where the antlers are covered with this like very rich blood supplied we call it velvet, right? It's this hair-like membrane that we call velvet. And that is living tissue. Everything you're seeing on the top of the head when covered in velvet is living tissue. And so those antlers are going to grow rapidly from that pedicle, which is that bony protrusion that we often talk about. Or if you've ever seen a buck shed, they still tend to have that bony protrusion on the top of their head. So, during spring and summer, we're talking maybe growing 3/4 of an inch to an inch per week for some of these bucks. So we're talking really, really fast growing tissue.
Some of the fastest growing living tissue that we know of.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, in fact, it grows faster than a lot of cancer. It is a type of cancer. I'd like to mention that here in a little bit, but yeah, it's fascinating. And again, deer are the only species, cervids are the only animals that can grow essentially what is an arm out of the top of their head, shed it, and then do it again every single year. It's pretty unbelievable. And when we take this back to things like habitat management or, providing nutrition and resources that allow these animals to do this, and when you think about it like that, like, hey, every year odds are stacked against them already to get eaten by something, but also they got to grow arms out of the top of their head. It requires a lot of resources to do that, as you can imagine.
Yes, it does. And it's fun to think about whitetails growing antlers, right? That's pretty remarkable in and of itself. But you think about other members of the deer family, elk, moose, and just how large of antlers those animals are growing. And they're doing that every single year. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's wild. And the process in itself, right? So not only is it the resources that they consume that year, but it's resources from previous years too. When you start thinking about like the state of osteoporosis that they go through. So not only are they consuming resources and putting those towards antlers, but they'll pull minerals and stuff from their ribs, just like you hear osteoporosis in humans, where you're using up minerals and things from your skeletal system. Deer do the same exact thing. And they put things like calcium and phosphorus from their skeletal system into that antler growth. And they're the only animals that can go through osteoporosis during antler growth and then correct it afterwards. Like they can turn it on and then turn it off and do it every year.
So to go through essentially osteoporosis to grow antlers, there's got to be some benefit to growing those antlers, right? So why don't we talk about that real quick? Why grow antlers? What's the benefit of having a set of antlers on top of your head?
Well, there's a couple of thoughts there, right? One, we know that bucks fight, right? That's just kind of the mating strategy. So they need those to protect themselves. We often don't think about that, but protect themselves from predators, but also to fight and compete with each other. And then also we've seen some research to show that larger antlers can be a sign of better genetics or something like that, right? So if a doe says, "Hey, you've got really nice antlers," that probably is a sign that if I reproduce with you, I'm going to have more successful offspring.
Yeah, a lot of times we refer to antlers as something called a honest signal, because you can't grow your largest, the maximum size antlers that you can grow if you have something else going on, like an injury or poor quality nutrition or something like that. So if you have a large set of antlers, that just is a reflection of the individual quality of the animal.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll see deer say they'll injure the hind left leg, and then you'll see that the right antler is weird or doesn't grow correctly. So you'll see that what do they call that, Eric? Do you remember?
That term is escaping my mind at the moment.
Me too, but I encourage the listeners to look into that. But yes, that's a very cool phenomenon that happens. Injury on one side affects the antler growth on the other side. Really, really cool stuff.
There's other things that can affect antler growth as well. We oftentimes think about pedicle injuries as having a similar effect, where you have an antler injury from the breeding season where it actually damages the pedicle. Then you might have what we've heard a lot of times be referred to as a funky antler, right?
Yeah.
And you have one perfect side and the other side is a spike or, a split spike or something to that effect. And that's something that generally doesn't change across time once you have a pedicle injury, but it can. We've seen deer in our research pens that 1 year tend to have a messed up side of their antlers, and the next year it comes back for whatever reason. So lots of different things that can impact antler growth.
Yeah, I think about antler growth every year, as we all do, but going back through the literature and that kind of thing each year, it's just fascinating the way that they work. Just kind of hit back what you were talking earlier, the fastest growing animal tissue that we know of, and what they found is it's pretty well correlated with like a type of cancer. It is essentially a bone cancer that these animals go through every year as they form these antlers and then go through the process of growing and then shedding eventually and all of that, just from start to finish. And again, those resources that they're consuming, the resources that they consumed last year, all of this is going into producing these appendages on the top of their head.
Yeah. And antlers, like we said, they're amazing. We could spend an entire podcast episode just talking about antlers and antler growth. But let's bring it back to nutrition.
Yeah. So if we start talking about antler growth, like you said, it's exciting, it's cool, all that good stuff. When we start getting to that point where you've got hardened antler, you're talking about, this is essentially bone that is composed of about 45% protein. So that had to have come from somewhere, right? So it takes, body growth and maintenance takes precedence over antler growth. But once you've hit all of those and you've got what you need, then we're pushing all of those resources into growing those antlers. So if protein isn't available, say during spring and summer, you can imagine that antlers are going to suffer. So you can actually see those short-term effects. When I was in South Texas, it was really evident. So you'd have some years where you had really, really good rains, and you'd have others where you didn't have any spring rains. And so you would see these bucks as they fluctuated in antler size. Some of these big bucks, they would get smaller from year to year or bigger one year. It just really depended on that rainfall. Just to kind of reiterate what we're talking about, nutrition going into antler growth, it matters. It matters a whole lot.
And that's one of the hypotheses regarding why antlers are shed from year to year as well. I mean, when you have these highly variable environments like you have in South Texas, 1 year you might have a lot of high quality nutrition on the ground. You can grow a larger set of antlers, but in the next year, if you don't get the same rains, you don't have the same level of nutrition available, you're not putting as much effort into growing those antlers, right? You're just trying to survive. So in the subsequent year, you might not put on the same set of antlers and as large of antlers as you did in the prior year, all corresponding with nutrition.
Yep, that's a good point. And it's not just protein. We tend to harp on protein anytime we're talking deer, but it's a balanced diet, right? We need to make sure that even in their stressful, and that's why we're calling this a stressful period, the groceries aren't typically there, and they've got these increased nutritional requirements. But it's not just the protein; it's all the minerals, it's the vitamins, it's all of that good stuff. We know that especially calcium and phosphorus are really important for antler growth.
Yeah, exactly. And as we start talking about proceeding through the summer, if you think about it in terms of a graph, you've got increasing energetic demands, right? You have antler growth, highly energetically demanding time period for bucks. You also have lactation, gestation for does, very demanding time periods. And as all these things are occurring, you seem to have a decrease in the quality of nutrition available on the landscape with the senescence of vegetation or maturing of the vegetation. Talking about spring green up, one of the reasons why that vegetation is such high quality is because it's all new growth. And generally speaking, what we see with vegetation is new growth has higher quality than old mature growth on the plant. So that's where you start to see this mixed match, and the energetic demands of what you're going through at this time of the year versus what's available for nutrition on the landscape.
Yeah, and it's also a weird time because it's typically there's this lag where the nutrition from spring green up is declined, but you're not yet seeing your mass production, your soft or hard mass production, right? You're not seeing the acorns yet, or the persimmons, or the muscadines, that kind of thing, that make up a really integral part of a deer's diet during the fall. So it's kind of that weird period, the dog days of summer, But yeah, very important points there. And is there anything else we want to mention when it comes to antlers? I mean, I could talk about it all day, just how fascinating I think it all is, but. Here's what I'll say. There's three things. We always preach this. There's three things that grow antlers, right?
Yep.
So that's nutrition is what we're harping on today, but don't forget about age. That's one of the most common things I run into with people that are interested in having larger antler bucks on their property is if you harvest them before they have reached their antler potential, you're not going to see that full antler potential. And we know that bucks typically put on their max antler size about 6 years old, right? All right, so we're talking bucks, and yeah, they've got somewhat of a tough time, but I don't think that what they're going through late summer is comparable to what does are experiencing. When we start talking about late summer stress, we're talking does.
Yeah. Does are hitting, they're moving from gestation to lactation. And lactation is the most energetically demanding time period for any mammal. It doesn't matter what species you're talking about, right? Producing milk takes a lot of energy to do. So you have this time period now where does are entering lactation and their peak energy demands are peaking, I should say, as we're starting to come into this nutritional stressor time period of late summer. So there's a lot going on both sides for bucks and for does.
Yeah, and I don't want to skip the gestational part there too. So we peak fawning season is in July in most of the states. So we do have plenty of does that are probably still carrying fawns. They're in that really late, period of gestation, and we know that is a really nutritionally stressful period. In fact, and like you said, gestation, late term gestation, and then a lactation are the most nutritionally stressful period for any mammal in the world. Like it's really tough times. And if you combine that, what we were talking about with the decline in nutritional quality, that's a conundrum in nature. It's kind of a weird situation, one that I've never really understood. And then if you also throw in how hot it is outside, just to throw one more stressor, which we'll mention a little bit here later. But yeah, so gestation is typically about 200 days, 205 days for whitetail. So when they conceive in the fall, they are immediately starting to grow a fawn. So you're talking about having to grow a whole nother being, which means that you're eating for two. You often hear it said, right? So they're having to consume everything that they need. Again, a high quality diet, high quality plants, high quality plant parts without getting eaten, so that they can, eat enough food that's going to develop muscle mass and fat layer deposits and skeletal system strengthens for fawns. Like you're talking about just growing a whole new being. It's pretty impressive.
And gestation is pretty cool for white-tailed deer when you think about it. I mean, deer have such a large range across North America, right? So Think about a deer up in Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota. They're going through another very nutritionally demanding time period of winter. So we think about gestation being 3 periods, right? It's a trimester. The first 2, there's not a whole lot going on. That fawn is growing, but not at the same rate. And then the last trimester period coincides with spring green up, generally speaking. And that's where most of the fawn growth is going to occur in utero, is during that last period. So it's pretty cool how deer have adapted across their range.
Yeah, it is. And all this increase in nutritional demand it's all going. And you'll see pictures of this. I get people that send pictures every year of these does that are essentially just hips and ribs. And chances are they've got 2 fawns running around, fawn twins running around that's milking them for everything they've got, literally. And so you're seeing this huge increase in energy and nutrient intake to support that fetal growth and gestation. And then of course, once that fawn hits the ground, you're talking about milk production. So, and that is truly the most energetically taxing event for any mammal on the planet, is consuming vegetation and turning it into milk to feed that fawn.
And it really, when we start talking about antler growth, it begins with the females, with the does, right? Some of the work that I did for my PhD, we showed it takes about 2 generations of changing that nutritional quality on the landscape for antlers to respond on a larger scale. A maternal effect is essentially what we call it. The environment that the mother is experiencing, she's translating that to her fawn in utero. And that fawn is going to grow a set of antlers that corresponds with the quality of nutrition that's available on the landscape at that time period, right? And it's really, you think about it as an advantage. You don't want to grow such a big body and such big antlers that you can't support that with the quality of nutrition that you're going to experience when you hit the ground. So the phenotype, the antlers and the body size are going to be correlated to the nutritional quality. But once you start improving the nutrition across time, antlers and body sizes will start to improve as well.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. It's not something before your research that I would have thought much about, but it makes perfect sense that it's probably not good for you to eat yourself out of house and home. So if you grow so big that you can't feed yourself the following year, that's probably not going to allow you to live very long. So it makes sense. Nature's got it figured out.
Not very advantageous to outgrow yourself, basically.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. We were talking antlers, we're talking nutrition, but it takes 3 things to grow antlers, right? It takes good nutrition, it takes age, they've got to grow long enough to reach that antler potential, and then it takes genetics. Unfortunately, there's not anything we can do about genetics, but the nutrition, like we're talking about today, this is where we can really make sure that we're, I guess you could say, making those stressful periods a little less stressful, with good habitat management, warm season food plots, things like that. So glad you brought that back to antlers. I could continue talking about antlers as well, but let's get back to the ones that's got it the toughest, right? And that's going to be the females. So when you start talking about the does, late stages of the gestation, growing fawns are hitting the ground. Now we've got to produce milk to feed those fawns. You're talking about spending, 20% of their total energy required to produce fawns during pregnancy, and the remaining 80% during lactation. So we're talking a ton of resources. And again, we're talking protein, we're talking energy, we're talking all of those minerals, vitamins, things like that. So, and then once fawns hit the ground, you're looking at peak milk production for, somewhere 20, 30 days there. Post birth. So this is a lot, it's feeding these fawns for a long period of time.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it takes a lot of energy to produce offspring.
Yeah.
And all that translates into antler size and quality later in life for those male offspring.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why that summer nutrition, and I talk about this a lot with landowners because we're all interested in, say, our deer management during deer season. We're all about that, right? We're all about cool season food plots, things like that, because that's when it's on our mind. That is when it's deer season. We're out and about. We are able to get in the stand. That's when deer are on our mind. But when we're talking about truly benefiting deer, antler growth, lactation, gestation, the future, like you were mentioning earlier, it's really that summer stress period where if we could manipulate the habitat in a way that it's going to produce groceries during those stressful periods, that's when we're going to see the advantage or benefit, I should say.
Yeah, it really all comes back to what are your objectives? Do you really only want to think about deer and deer hunting during deer season, or is this something that you're really passionate about that you want to put in effort year round. And if that's the case, then yeah, there's plenty to do throughout the entire year.
Yeah.
You can be managing the landscape all year round, and that is going to really help you achieve those objectives if your goal is to shoot older age class, larger bucks.
Yep. I'm going to throw a wrench in there that I mentioned earlier. If late summer didn't already suck enough, right, with all of these increased nutritional demands and stuff, what about the temperature? What about just how hot it is outside?
Exactly. This time of year, I mean, just last week we were hitting heat indices well into the hundreds, and it was hot, very hot.
I remember in South Texas, I think it was last year, there were several days where the heat index was 123. I mean, it's unbelievable. And yet these animals are out there trying to survive, and not only that, but reproduce and grow fawns and everything else. But yeah, that's another thing to throw an issue in there. One of the most energetically, taxing things that we as warm-blooded animals do is maintain that internal body temperature, right? It's like a thermostat. So it's going to stay around, 98.6 for us. It's about 100 degrees for a deer 101. But when you start putting environmental pressure, so the heat from the sun, the 123 degree heat index, that body temperature starts wanting to elevate. Well, as soon as that thermostat's tripped and needs to bring it back down to where it's supposed to be, you start seeing a really, really huge increase in energy demands. So they're burning through all of this energy, whatever nutrition that they're consuming, they're burning through that to try to maintain that body temperature. But they need to be focusing on all of these things like growing fawns or feeding fawns, growing antlers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and take that one step further. There's some new work coming out showing that consuming protein might actually increase your body temp as well. So it might be your internal body temp also potentially related to the food that you're eating, which is going to dictate what food you're eating and what you have available on the landscape.
Yeah, and protein may be even more increasing body temperature when you eat. But that's another thing that I'm glad you brought up, because here we are, these animals are faced with this increased nutritional need. But when you, get up and move around to try to find that high quality forage, you're increasing your heat gain, right? And the game should be to get rid of as much heat as possible. Go lay in the shade, take advantage of the cool wind if you can find some, but you can't, because your nutritional requirements are through the roof. You need to get up, you got to go find food. Therefore, you're creating more heat. When you eat anything, that metabolic heat that's produced. So that's another thing. That's why oftentimes if you're out working in the heat, you're not hungry. Your body's saying, we don't need to produce any more heat. We need you to get rid of it. We need you to sweat, evaporative cooling, all that good stuff. Deer can't sweat. So that's one more thing against them, right? So yeah, it's an interesting situation with the summer heat and the increased nutritional needs.
Yeah, it's some pretty cool stuff. And we have a student starting this fall that's going to be conducting a diet selection study. And technology has really advanced where we can hopefully get a better understanding of not just broad categories that deer are consuming throughout the year, but more specific plant species that they're consuming. So we can get a better understanding of what times of the year they're consuming more protein, because if they can't consume a lot of protein in late summer anyway, just due to the metabolic heat and air temps and things like that, what are they relying on? Are they switching vegetation types? I mean, what does that actually look like? So lots of cool questions to be answered yet.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. And I think that what I'm excited about for that project is it's going to help us identify, our different habitat management regimes, the techniques that we're using, the vegetation that we're promoting. How does that benefit at different times during the year? Like, what is that seasonal changes in diet? And it's really interesting, like you just said, what are we going to see in late summer? Not only what's available, but if that was not a limitation, what would they be selecting to try to combat the nutritional requirement increase, but also the temperature?
Yeah, that's gonna be a really fun study. I'm looking forward to getting that one going this fall.
So what else?
Well, talking about this decline in nutritional quality, what can we do to combat that? If you're listening to this podcast, all right, so bucks are growing their antlers. That's a nutritional or energetically demanding time period. Not a lot of nutrition, high quality nutrition available at that point in time. Late gestation, lactation for does, high energetic demands, but we see this declining in nutritional availability and quality of these plants. So what do we do? How can we combat this?
Well, First and foremost, good habitat management is what I always preach, and that's what I live by as well, right? Manage your property in a way that's going to allow it to reach its potential as far as providing deer food and cover, interspersed in a way that's going to make life easy for them. That is the best thing that you can do. Another thing that you should not overlook is water. Make sure that you have water available to these animals. In South Texas, this was a much bigger deal because that reliable water source suddenly one year just wasn't reliable anymore. It would dry up, and then suddenly you've got no water within 10 square miles. Not so much of an issue here in the Southeast, but just another reason to protect your riparian areas and different things like that to make sure the creeks are still flowing, all that good stuff. But I would say that many of our listeners, habitat and wildlife managers like we are, they're interested in warm season food plots, and that is one thing that can be an absolute game changer. Again, these stressful periods, the summer stress period is going to happen every single year. There's not a thing you can do about it. But what you can do is manage in a way that's going to make it a little less stressful. And summer food plots are great for that.
Yeah, they really are. And we start talking about food plots, and we're really trying to talk about high quality protein that's available. I mean, you're talking about when we're discussing food plots, we're talking about having a lot of high quality protein available relative to the landscape, right? And it becomes really important because, like we talked about, deer are what we call concentrate selectors. So they have relatively small stomachs compared to something like a cow or an elk or a moose. So they have to consume the highest quality part of each plant because they just don't have the room to consume a lot of low quality vegetation. They just won't get enough out of it. So making sure that there's the high quality vegetation on the landscape so that it's readily available for those animals, it becomes really, really important.
Yeah, and we're talking deer. We're talking about an animal that evolved to eat vegetation, right? Not some feed that you pour out of a bag. So when we start talking about warm season food plots, we're actually again, I mentioned habitat management first, but warm season food plot, we're planting vegetation. We're planting different types of forages that are going to allow them, in many cases, I like to plant mixes and things that are going to allow them the options. It's there if they need it, but I know this is going to sound a little bit weird, sounded like I wasted all my money. I'm not happy about it, but if they're not messing with my food plots, I'm okay with that because that means Mother Nature and the habitat that I've worked hard on is producing. But if they are needing that supplement, then I want it to be there. And again, we're going to see these tough times every year. But if we can put vegetations that's out there that's going to allow them to reach their protein needs, their energy needs, phosphorus, calcium, all those good minerals and things like that, then it's a win, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned feed. It's really interesting because deer have incredibly complex digestive systems, right? They have 4-chambered stomachs. Their rumen is incredibly complex. And when you start talking about greatly manipulating what they're eating on the landscape, when we're talking vegetation versus feed versus corn or something, grain, something like that, it actually changes the bacterial composition within their rumen and their efficiency in being able to digest whatever they're consuming. In the north, a lot of times over winter, we'll talk about things like acidosis, where deer will get into just these grain piles of corn, and it's just become so much they don't have anything to buffer the pH increase that they literally die. I hear about that from time to time. So it's really interesting when we start talking about the vegetation that deer are consuming and why it's important to have high quality food on the landscape for them to digest.
Yeah, and this is a topic that I've spent a lot of time on, and I really appreciate because we think about herbivores and then we categorize them further down into ruminants. And then a lot of people don't realize that even within ruminants, there are very, very different ways that they eat. So cow's a great example of giant gut, relatively slow metabolism, so they can just pack themselves full and go sit in the shade and work through and really break down that tough vegetation, which is grass. Grass tends to be the lower quality vegetation. Whereas white-tailed deer, like you said, much smaller gut, and they have a high metabolism, which means if you're going to feed that metabolic rate, you need something that's going to come in that's going to be able to be broken down very quickly, the nutrients extracted out of it quickly, pass, and then consume more and more of that. So yeah, like you said, concentrate selectors, not even just particular plants, but particular plant parts. And it's not just, okay, we'll offer them the highest quality plant there is. Well, when you're talking nutrients, it's a system of checks and balances. You don't want to overshoot one, like for example, consuming 200 times the amount of sulfur that you need to consume just to hit your protein, right? So we know that deer have been documented to eat over 400 different species of plants. So these are all high quality plants, or most are high quality plants. But again, they're picking and choosing based on meeting each one of those individual nutritional needs. So it is very complex, all while doing this, trying not to get eaten by something, growing antlers, growing fawns, and feeding fawns when it's really, really hot outside.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. Deer, like you said, if they're in need of a mineral or vitamin or whatever it may be, they're going to find that plant that's going to fill that gap in their nutrition. They're going to be able to figure that out. It's really remarkable. I mean, these animals it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, they're going to find it if we give them options. So that is, we preach diversity, and I think some people sometimes feel that it's a cop-out when we say, oh, well, you should be managing for a diverse vegetative community. Well, we're not going to ever be able to know what a deer needs more than a deer knows what they need, right? So in my opinion, deer management is the concept of deer management is very easy. We're trying to make life easy and convenient for white-tailed deer, and we're trying to make sure they have all the options they need so that they can find exactly what it is that they need.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned warm season food plots. Are there any other habitat management techniques that we can use to diversify the plant community at that time of the year?
Well, yeah, absolutely. You get to early growing season fires. We're seeing that different fire regimes, timing, and that kind of thing can help promote forb growth. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Whether you're thinning timber stands to let sunlight get to the ground, whether you're putting a fire through to promote forb growth, you're doing all of these things so that it produces deer habitat 365 days a year, right? We're not thinking like, oh, well, I just want to make sure they got food and somewhere to live in September or in October during bow season. No, the name of the game is to make sure that they got everything they need. Life's easy. It's convenient. They've got all their options 365 days a year.
Yep. Different vegetative responses at different times of the year. And that can be done a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and we've got several episodes, Bronson and Steve, several episodes of fire timing and stuff like that. So go look those up. Yeah, early growing season fires, late growing season fires, you can accomplish different things. But ultimately, getting fire on the landscape, I'm always going to promote that whenever you can because there's only so many burn days. But I feel like we're getting off a little bit here. But anyways, it's tough time for white-tailed deer in late summer, and do what we can to make sure they got the groceries they need to be successful. All right, so late season or late summer stress periods. So let's kind of do a recap, Eric. So we're talking bucks growing antlers. So again, growing arms out of the top of their head, that requires a lot of nutrients. We're talking does growing fawns, bone, muscle, all that good stuff. And then eventually birthing that fawn and having to turn everything that they eat into milk. So we're talking some very stressful situations, some situations that require a lot of excess nutrients that maybe they didn't need other times of the year. We're also talking about a time of the year where it's extremely hot outside, which is also energetically demanding. And it just so happens that any of the good spring greenup that we got back in the April, May rains, that vegetation that was produced is no longer very high quality. So it's kind of like a situation, these late summer stress periods, that's tough. That's why we call them the stress period, right? It's a tough situation.
Yeah, but you can mitigate that stressful or try to help to mitigate that stressful time period by engaging in active habitat management, planting those warm season food plots, varying your burn times through spring and summer to try to make sure you have variation in the vegetative responses. All those different things can help limit those nutritional stressor time periods.
Exactly. That's the name of the game. These stress periods are going to happen every year, sometimes more stressful than others. Let's do what we can as deer managers to make those stressful periods a little less stressful. And speaking of food plots, tune in next episode. It's about that time. We're going to start talking cool season food plots, and who doesn't love building a successful food plot? And that's what we're going to talk about. So y'all tune in for the next one. Thank y'all for listening. Y'all have a good one.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson family for their endowed financial support. We would not be able to do this without it. We're also grateful to our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service, and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center.
If you have questions or ideas, check out MSUDeerLab.com and hit the Deer University tab. Thanks for listening.